Hello, and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. As you can see, today's topic is Classical Age Empires Part 2, and we're focusing in on East Asia, India, and the Americas. Now, we are going to pick up where we left off, which is we talked about those Mediterranean empires. Today we want to focus in first on the Chinese. Before we begin, as always, take a moment, hit pause on this video, jot down the lecture outline, the remaining part of it, and pay particular attention to those key terms at the left, because you might need those later. You got it? Let's get started. Now, while we're going to talk about the Roman Empire in a future video, I want you to understand that while Rome is going to begin to rise in the West, following the demise of the Greeks, we are going to see a simultaneous rise of a new dynasty in the East, in China. And so, when we last talked about China, they were in what we call the Warring States period. This Warring States period that had lasted from about 500 BCE until 220 BCE. So we're talking nearly 300 years of Warring States period. But during this time, where these 20 warlords, these regional rulers, are fighting for the control of China, new thoughts, new philosophies begin to emerge. Number one being that simply a lot of Chinese common people believe that the heavens would send someone to unify and bring peace. Again, that's the old mandate of heaven coming back. But that's just, again, a lot of people have hope during tumultuous times. Far more important here is that there were three new philosophies, schools of thought, if you will, that developed during this Warring States period as people are trying to just grasp and find something that will get them out of this chaos. Again, 300 years is a long time. Well, these three main doctrines will emerge. Number one is legalism. Under the idea or the philosophy of legalism, that humans were inherently, naturally evil. And as such, they will only obey by force. So, people are evil, they're born that way, they will naturally do evil things, and you need a firm hand to crack down and force them to obey. A second school of thought emerged called Taoism. Again, much like the next one we'll talk about, Taoism is not a religion, it's a thought. It's a philosophy. Under Taoism, this was very much a back to nature. So where legalism was about clamping the hammer down, throwing down the gauntlet and trying to bring peace through strength, Taoism was very much a get back to nature. Let's just pull back from society. So on the one extreme is legalism. On the other extreme, let's just check out from society, is Taoism. Taoism emphasized the idea that you just need to avoid useless, mundane, stupid struggle and simply follow the path or the Tao. You need to turn back to nature, focus on acceptance, and as an individual, retreat from society. So the two extremes, legalism and Taoism. The third one, however, kind of struck a middle ground, and that was Confucianism. And again, I want to reiterate this. We'll talk a little more about Confucianism later, but Confucianism is not a religion. It's a thought. It's a philosophy. And under Confucianism, it emphasized the importance of hierarchical, harmonious relationships. In other words, if you want to have an orderly society, you need to have a hierarchy. Yes, there must be a hierarchy in life. But these relationships need to be very structured. And the emphasis on this is very important because it emphasized that there's these unequal relationships in life. There is father-child. There is husband-wife. There is employer-employee. There is emperor and subject. Now, Confucianism as a thought emphasized that the family unit was the model for which the entire society should look like. And so within your own family, you have a hierarchy. You have a husband who's over the wife, again, in Confucian thought. You have the parents who are over the children, and the children need to be in deference to the parents, but the parents should also not take advantage or brutally, hurt the children. And so it emphasized these right relationships. And of course, like the family unit then, with the emperor, you should give deference to the emperor. He's in charge, but the emperor in turn should not, punish unjustly subjects. And so here we go. We have this warring states period. And after nearly 300 years of fighting, a new leader is going to emerge. His name was Shi Huangdi. You see him right there. And he is going to implement strict rule. He is going to clamp down, and he's going to drop the hammer. And he is going to, through brute force, bring peace, end the Warring States period, and establish a new dynasty in 220 BCE. He is going to use his iron weapons and sheer tenacity to defeat the other states and bring back a unified China. He's going to do so, however, under the thought of legalism. He's going to use that legalism to strip power from the nobles and create a strong, centralized bureaucracy. He will divide China into administrative provinces with administrators that he controlled. He will build roads for communication and to move troops. He will begin the first fortifications that will become the Great Wall of China. He maybe is most famous for the tomb of the terracotta soldiers. And he will do some other good things, such as he will, and very important for future, he will standardize laws and currencies. So one law throughout all the land, one currency throughout all the land. He will create a standardized script or writing. He will actually use the Shang dynasty writing process. And it became the common script for all communication. He also is going to set this firm foundation upon which the rest of Chinese history rests. Now, let me be very clear. In my opinion, the ends never justifies the means. And despite these good things he did, again, there's some good things here. Great Wall of China begins, major road systems. He standardizes, weights and measures and currencies and laws, standardizes script, creates a strong bureaucracy. All those things are fine. He also burns the books of philosophy, of ethics, of history, of literature. In other words, he wanted to control the past, the present, and the future himself. And again, under this legalistic doctrine. He also will sentence Confucians who complained about this legalism to death. In other words, you want to complain about him being too harsh? He's going to kill you. Now, again, the ends never justifies the means. But what he does do in his very short rule, and you can see the dates, he rules from 220 until 210 himself, and then his successor will take over for 4 years before he's ousted. What he does, though, is he's going to pave the way for the next major, largest, longest dynasty, the Han. He will also create the most complex bureaucracy of the classical age. A bureaucracy complex system that will endure until the 20th century. I mean, you're talking almost 2,000 years that he set the stage for. Again, I'm not saying the end justifies the means. He was brutal, harsh, basically a dictator. But he does set the stage for the future. Speaking of which, his successor was weaker, nowhere near, and by that point, people were just, no. We understood legalism at first because got us out of the Warring States period, but now, no, it's too harsh. And what we see then is a new dynasty arise, the Han Dynasty. So the Han Dynasty is going to topple the Qin Dynasty and establish a long 400-year dynasty. And then you see the first ruler there, Luo Bang, who established this Han dynastic rule. And he will restructure some things from the Qin Dynasty. He will organize and control through a non-hereditary bureaucracy. In other words, just because your dad was a bureaucrat doesn't mean you have to be one also. He will, of course, embody the mandate of heaven, but he does so under Confucian values. So again, the Qin tried legalism, it failed. Taoism was considered too much of nothing. And so the Han Dynasty is going to embrace Confucian values. Again, right relationships. And so, right as we're going to see in our next lecture regarding Rome, right as Rome is rising to power on the back of the fall of the Greek Empire, we're going to see the rise of the Han Dynasty. And while Luo Bang is the one who's credited with becoming the first emperor of it, it is his successor here, Han Wudi, in 156, who is going to really take it to the next level. He is going to break up large estates of noblemen and kind of divide it among the sons. Because the fear was, if you allow a family, a nobleman, to have too much power, many of them have their own armies, that it would be a threat to the kingdom. And so this helped check the power. In addition, he persuaded, forced, highly suggested that noblemen have a house in the capital city. The idea that he could keep an eye on them. And for their part, they got to have a lavish house within the central city. And as a result, he had a nice centralized government. And something that very fascinating was that 30% of the Chinese population would live in these urban cities, these urban centers. Something unheard of at the time in global history. He will expand through both trade and warfare and push China's borders, the empire's borders. And you can see on the map there, he's not only going to expand from the previous dynasties, but he will also push into places like Korea, taking parts of northern Korea. He also will defeat numerous nomads. He will increase the Great Wall of China. And he will begin to build the Forbidden City. Again, the centralized bureaucratic state where he was able to keep watch on the noblemen. And again, the whole idea here was that it was built on Confucian values. And so these right relationships, you had to have scholar bureaucrats, you had to have farmers, artisans, merchants, soldiers. Each one had to show deference to the other one. These right relationships within a family that translate to right relationships within the empire. So he creates a strong central bureaucracy. One of his biggest, most important contributions, besides expanding the Great Wall of China, besides the Forbidden City, is what is known as the Civil Service Exam. So this is something the United States adopted in the 1800s. The Civil Service Exam was an exam given to prospective government employees. You want to be a government bureaucrat? You need to take this test. And the idea of it, at least in theory, was that it would find the best qualified people, no matter your hereditary status. Now, in ancient China, this was a test of Confucianism. Did you understand? Were you well versed in the Confucian philosophies? So, on the one hand, this was revolutionary. It was revolutionary when the United States adopted it. Because the idea was it didn't matter your wealth, your background, your familial connections. It simply was designed to find the best possible candidate and fit for that government job so that everyone who was working for the government was well educated, well versed, and could function a proper, good bureaucracy. In theory. In practice, much like the United States at the present, there is a loophole that often gets overlooked. Again, this is not necessarily the intended result, it's just what happens. So, in theory, everyone is eligible. Okay? The problem is that while wealth was not a prerequisite to take the test or to get a government job, wealth was usually a prerequisite to study for the test. In other words, you had to have money in your family to pay for tutors so that you could learn the information about Confucianism to take the test. Much like we see in modern day US society where, you don't have to go to the #1 private Ivy League college in order to get a good job. Anyone is eligible to get in there. All you need is good grades. Well, we also know that it takes money often to go to better schools and hire tutors to get those good grades, to get in those Ivy League schools, and then it takes money to once you get there. And so while technically it is a huge leap forward, it still largely reserves government roles for the wealthy. In addition, as it might go without saying, women were excluded. Now, speaking of which, there was a definite hierarchy, and in general there were 3 classes in their society. There was the emperor on top. Below them was the first class, we'll call them. They were the scholar gentry. These are the palace court, these are noble, these are government officials. They often had homes both in the countryside and in the cities. Below them were what we will call them, ordinary commoners, but free citizens. So these were free people. These were the peasants. And this is unique to Chinese history. Usually every other hierarchical pyramid we look at throughout global history, it's always the kind of priest and ruler on top, then the nobles, then those artisans, merchants, and artisans and merchants. In China, however, merchants were looked on with disdain. They were seen as selfish who only cared about themselves, and therefore, within Confucian thought, they were lowered almost like scum, even though they brought a lot of wealth to the kingdom. And so, in Chinese society, below the first class noblemen is the peasants, the farmers, because they're the ones who are providing food for the empire. Then below them are your artisans, your craftsmen, your merchants, and then there's underclass, which I know on my screen it says slaves. The reality was, within Han China, compared to, say, Rome, there were actually comparatively small number of slaves. Instead, what this group includes not only is some slaves, but also just non-Han Chinese, also bandits, beggars, and vagabonds. Now, under the Han Dynasty, we will see an explosion of Chinese technology, including new inventions, things like the brush pen, paper, water mills for agricultural purposes, rudders and compasses for ships. Fun fact, the largest ships in the world came from China. And they were able to navigate the oceans using a compass far before the Europeans figured it out. Also unique, kind of a little fun fact here, which is the Chinese used magnetic south rather than magnetic north to navigate the oceans. They also developed new mining techniques for iron and copper. They are also the ones who pioneer the use of steel, which, if you don't know, is the process by which you remove the impurities from iron, which means you have to superheat, melt the iron, and usually in a fire. Then as it gets hot and almost to a molten state, you beat the impurities out of it, and then you cool it, you reheat it, you repeat the process. Now, understand this is time consuming. it takes one Chinese metal worker, artisan, 12 hours to create one steel sword. It's inefficient, but a steel sword was vital to the Han Dynasty and later Chinese dynasties maintaining their power, because steel swords were far more effective and far more deadly than other weaponry. We also see that they are able to create decorative arts, bronze, ceramics, vases, jade, ivory, silk screens. Calligraphy became a big deal, where you were a warrior, sure, but you were also a, artist. There were advances in astronomy, geography, mathematics, acupuncture, seismographs, the crossbow. And one of the things they did as part of this whole Confucian thought was, and I want to talk about religion for a second here, was that while Confucianism was the state ideology, Taoism still had its place. In fact, they allowed Taoism to be very influential when it came to things like medicine and philosophy. So even though the kind of official policy was Confucianism, again, I'm using the term religion broadly, loosely, very generally here, because neither Taoism nor Confucianism is actually a religion. They are thoughts. They are philosophical thoughts. But as far as being a thought process, the Han Dynasty was fairly tolerant of other political or philosophical thoughts. They allowed Taoism, and they also allowed the entrances of Buddhism, who would arrive from India via the Silk Road trade. Now, one more thing as part of this whole Confucian format was that while it was about right relationships, and they were far less harsh than, say, the Qin Dynasty, one of the things that they did do, however, if you were a commoner, a free peasant, was that you were required every year for a certain number of days, that could change throughout from year to year, but a certain number of days you were required to leave your home and go perform labor on public works projects, things like the Great Wall of China. In addition, should there be a military need, you could be asked to serve in the military. And when I say asked, I mean forced. Hey, if you want a visual reference of this, if you've ever seen the movie Pocahontas, Mulan, whether the animated from 1990s or the more recent live action, the idea that the emperor comes to a small city and basically demands that you volunteer for the military. And again, it's a demand. It's voluntold, not volunteer. Now, as I said, this dynasty is going to last for 400 years. Though, to be clear, the peak of it was the first 200 years. The last 200 years, it was in a slow but steep decline. Usually, the steep decline was caused by weak rulers. They had issues defending their borders because of the expanse of the empire. There were nomadic invasions. Local nobles began taking more power. And then finally, there would be a peasant uprising. It was known as the Yellow Turban Rebellion. So following a series of floods and epidemics, wandering bands of peasants joined together and formed a massive populist movement that reached to the numbers of about 360,000 Chinese who armed themselves in 184 CE. They used Taoism and mystical rituals to unify themselves and called for a new age of equality and peace. Now, they were eventually quelled and crushed by the Han military, but the rebellion and military campaign weakened the state and would eventually lead to the dynastic's collapse. And which the end of the Han Dynasty in 220 CE is going to lead to another period of chaos, another warring states period for another 135 years. But again, we'll come back to that in a future lecture. For now, let's turn our attention to India and South Asia. So in India, we're going to see two major dynasties, the Mauryan and the Guptas, two major empires. Now, India, throughout much of its history, was very decentralized and fragmented. In fact, it is said only 5 times in its history was it ever actually unified. It was unified under Alexander the Great. under the Mauryans, under the Guptas, under the Mughals, and then under the British. And then finally, they'll be unified in the 20th century as a modern, Indian nation. So, start with the Mauryans. The Mauryans were founded by Chandragupta Maurya following Alexander's withdrawal. So when Alexander's men forced him to retreat from India, that created a power vacuum. And Maurya here is going to take over. And understand, he's taking over an area that had been populated by these Aryans back, starting, we talked about in the previous lecture, around 1000 BCE. They had settled in these Himalayan foothills, and they had installed the caste system. Remember the four main varnas, the Brahmins, your priests, scholars, then you had your warriors, you had your landowners, your merchants, and your artisans, and then you had your commoners and your peasants. And these, of course, we talked about before, these varnas were later subdivided into jatis. Each had their own rituals and duties. Well, it was into this situation, following Alexander's retreat, that Maurya steps up and unifies India. Now, much like the other, we talked about other areas, this empire is going to unify very disparate, very diverse groups. And even though the geography of India is very diverse, the people were politically fragmented, following Alexander's withdrawal, people were looking for something to kind of like, wait, we just got invaded by an outsider. And Maurya is able to step in and fill that void and unify the nation. His empire will stretch, as you can see in the map, from modern-day Pakistan to the southern end of India. And he's going to unify. Now, most people who talk about the Mauryan Empire do not necessarily talk about Maurya himself. Instead, they focus on his grandson. His grandson is Asoka. I'm sorry, not that one. This one. So, Asoka the Great. Asoka the Great is most well known because his grandson, or Mauryan's grandson, Asoka, is going to convert to Buddhism. He was shocked by the bloodshed that had been allowed to occur under, Alexander the Great, and even under his grandfather's rule. And he turns to Buddhism. Again, Buddhism many times is miscategorized as a religion. Most often, Buddhism is not a religion. It's once again, like Confucianism, a thought. But now, there are some sects of Buddhism that are more religious than others. The idea of a deity. But basic Buddhism is more of a thought process, a philosophical thought. In this case, Asoka is shocked by the bloodshed. And he turns to Buddhism, turning to peace, tolerance, and nonviolence. He thought of himself as a father to the, for lack of a better term, Indian people. And he is going to unify and keep India together for as long as he is alive. Unfortunately, you see the dates, even though he will be replaced by his successor, his son, that empire's not going to last very long. In fact, you see the total dates on there. We're only talking 130 years here. And following the end of the Mauryan Empire, we're going to see, once again, a fragmented India for another 135 years. But in 320 CE, we are going to see the arisal of a new golden age of India, or in this case, the Gupta Empire. Now, it would never reach the territorial boundaries of the Mauryan Empire, but it is an empire in its own right. And this is considered India's golden age. As a government structure, they would draw tribute from their subjects, which also gave warrior elites a great deal of autonomy. It covered half of what is modern-day northern India. But what is most noted for is bringing peace to the realm for a good almost over 200 years. unifying India, something that had not been done very often in history. But perhaps more important, they are the ones who develop and kind of export the concept of zero to Europeans. They also develop the Arabic number system, also export chess, the game chess, and a number of medical and astronomical advances. Now, see, the Guptas were far more decentralized, allowing local rulers more autonomy, which on the one hand create a little more loyalty, but it also will set up the seeds of demise as those local rulers gain more power. We also see a revival, of Hinduism. And again, we'll talk more about Hinduism in a future lecture, but compared to the rise of Buddhism under the Mauryans, under the Guptas, we see a re-rise of Hinduism. But we also see a large bit of religious toleration here. As under the Guptas, while there was a revival of Hinduism, it coincided or coexisted with both Buddhism and Jainism. Again, we'll talk about those in a future lecture. Socioeconomically, they are very much a part of the Silk Road trade. They would trade silk, spices, and cottons with both Central Asia and the Mediterranean. There would still be the caste system, but we will see the growth of urban centers. We will also see the seeds of urban planning, along with the rise of Buddhist and Hindu temples. Now, jumping ocean, let's talk about the Americas. Now, last we talked about the Americas, they were kind of small. We had the Olmecs, and we had the Chavin. However, during this exact same period, as we're flipping the calendar from BCE to CE, we will see the rise of some new major empires in the Americas, in Mesoamerica. And so at the same time of these South Asian empires and the rise of the Qin dynasty in China, the growth of the Roman Empire we'll talk about next time, there were also these new empires in America. The first of which is Teotihuacan. This is located north of the Mayans, kind of close to modern-day Mexico City. There's an estimated population of 200,000 within this kind of urban center. Now again, I don't want to confuse. This is not the Mayas yet. This is separated from the Mayas. They had a very sophisticated, complex bureaucracy. They built reservoirs. They had apartment complexes, pyramid structures. They were especially known, you can kind of see in this image, this is looking at the two temples, looking from one to the other temple. The two main pyramids here, the temples, were the pyramids of the sun and the moon. Now, we also know that they traded and warred with the Maya, their neighbors. We don't fully know why they collapsed, but we assume issues of resources and also warring with neighboring areas, including the Maya. Speaking of which, the Maya. The Maya were probably the largest empire of this age in the Mesoamerican area. They were located in Central America and southern Mexico. They were integral to mathematical evolution, the concept of zero. Additionally, they created a complex writing system. They were able to, through the studying the stars, create a calendar that was actually far more accurate than our modern day calendar that we use. I mean, think about it. Every 4 years, we have to add a day to our calendars to make it work. The Mayans didn't need that. They had a so again, this is at Chichen Itza in southern Mexico. This is known as El Caracol, or the observatory. So it looks like a modern day observatory. If you look at the top left there, you can see where there were 3 windows out of this observatory, 3 viewing points. And from there, these created viewing angles that allowed the Mayas to track the stars. And again, you can pause this video and see what it says there, but each window allowed a very specific view of the night sky. The magnetic south, the southernmost position of Venus, the sunset of equinox, and finally the northernmost position of Venus. And this is important because just to understand how this all worked together, right? Let me go back a slide. The temple there on the left at Chichen Itza, that temple, you can't see it very well in the picture, but on the stairwell going down right here is a bunch of humps. At the bottom here, behind these people's heads, is a statue or a head of a carving of the plumed serpent Quetzalcoatl. And on the equinox, when the sun moves across the sky on the equinox, what it looks like is the shadow that is cast, it looks like a snake slithering down the side of the temple. In other words, their math and astronomical calculations were so precise that they were able to build this temple in a way that it made like a supernatural event occur. It's a magic trick, right? They were able to use math and science and the stars to calculate how to make the snake look like it slithers down the temple. Now, in addition to this, they also created a origin story to explain how and why they were there, known as the Popol Vuh. And this is the story that we have a lot of information on because archaeologists have been able to recreate it through pottery shards. And in the late 90s, early 2000s, a team of researchers actually animated it. You can find it on YouTube. And you can actually see the entirety of this creation story reanimated through these actual pottery shards and images. Now, I'm going to play a small clip here for you. And I'm going to give some commentary along the way. But what I want you to notice about this is some overlapping things that you may know through your own religious traditions. Take a look.
One of the workers' head was found in a dead and bearing tree. Instantly, that tree came to life.
Tree of Life.
Sprouting skulls and birds and blossoms. It was forbidden to go near that tree. It was forbidden to touch its fruit.
Forbidden fruit.
At the same time, there was a little girl. She heard the story of the miraculous tree told her by her father, like she a world of sugar. She thought, my family is this tree. It's really said to be true to nature.
Temptation.
And so she went, all by herself, to the tree.
Again, temptation.
This is not good at all. But your skull has turned around on the branches of its hand. You do believe it. Then put out your hand.
And then again, you can watch it for yourself, but it's going to go on, and it will talk about how she has basically a immaculate conception, virgin birth. Again, there's a lot of, say, Christian iconography in there that we believe that was also translated among the Mayas. Now, I didn't pass over this slide. I want to go back to it real quick, which is Tikal. Tikal was the largest structure in the Americas. They believe the city held 100,000 people. This is a 14-story temple that included a celestial observatory. And it believed that while the city itself had 100,000 people, it supported a nearby population, a surrounding population of nearly 5 million. And much like their counterparts in Afro-Eurasia, what we see here is that they are, number one, they have a tribute system to collect from local regional rulers, from people who were conquered. They were connected through these regional trade networks, and there was a connection between, a close relationship between spiritual and political leaders. Now, besides them, Down south, in what is modern-day Peru, we have the Mochi. This territory stretched some 250 miles from the Andes through the mountains of Peru. These were governed by a class of warrior priests who built temples and other large buildings, traded with neighboring peoples, created complex irrigation systems and terracing to maintain their crops. Much like the counterparts of the Maya, they will practice human sacrifice, but they were skilled craftsmen in jewelry, gold, and pottery. And again, this becomes the prelude to the Inca. Now, again, I know it's kind of fast, but the idea is I want you to understand what happened in Europe was also happening in Asia, was also happening in the Americas, even if it wasn't quite as glamorous at times. We don't have as much information at times. However, while these large classical age empires are being developed, while they are growing, there are some other groups that we need to know because they're going to come to play in future lectures, in future events. The first one is the Huns. I'm sure most students have heard of them. The Huns were the small group in modern-day Russia and in Mongolia. And we're going to spend a lot more time in more detail later, but by the 300 CE, they begin to move westward from their homeland and push into Central Asia. Most likely this is due to drought or competition for pastoral grazing lands. And we'll begin to see new leaders emerge, people like Attila the Hun. And he'll begin his conquer to create one of the largest land-based empires in history. But again, and by the way, it's the Huns that will play a role in the fall of the Gupta Empire, as their treasury is exhausted from trying to expel and push back the Huns. Elsewhere, modern-day Germany, we have what are known as the Germanic peoples. So as the Huns are on the move, these Germanic peoples are being pushed elsewhere, and they move into what is now modern-day Germany. These are the Ostrogoth, the Visigoth, the Franks, the Angles, the Saxons, the Vandals. And while the Huns begin to push into some of that old Roman territory, showing some weaknesses, the Germanic people also take heart, take courage, and they begin to take advantage and push against the Roman Empire in the north. So while neither one of these two groups is an empire yet, while neither one of these two groups is resembling what we're discussing, which is the Empire Age, both these groups are going to lead to the downfall of major empires. And as the Germanic peoples begin to move, groups like the Franks move into what is now France and begin a new country. The Angles and the Saxons move into what is now England and became, essentially found as Anglo-Saxons, quote unquote, white people. But while this is going on in Russia, Mongolia, and in Western Europe, to the south in Africa, we see also a dramatic change of demographics and migrations. We have what's known as the Bantu people, the Bantu migrations. And you see the dates on the screen. This is a 3,000-year process. This is not happening over in such a short time frame as, say, Alexander the Great. But what we believe happened is, as population grew as early as 2000 BCE, and possibly due to desertification, or was more deserts taking over due to climate change, they began to migrate and spread to the south and east. Now, languages differentiated into about 500 distinct dialects. They would occupy most of sub-Saharan Africa. Again, please note, as they travel, they do retain their culture, their religion, their languages, but they begin to interact with other people, and those languages begin to form new dialects. And they begin to assimilate and create new amalgamated cultural groups. Again, this is a small, slow process. It's gradual. They will introduce agriculture and iron metallurgy. They will also introduce the Bantu language. This is how we can track this. Is a lot of these languages of sub-Saharan Africa are traced back to the original Bantu language. But unlike their counterparts to the north and the east, the Bantus were a stateless society. They did not depend on an elaborate bureaucracy. Instead, societies were small, more tribal units. Think more like Native American groups in the United States. They were familial and kinship groups. They often had a village council to make big decisions that were usually from male family heads. The chief of the village was usually from a prominent family. And each group of villages was a district. And village chiefs would negotiate inter-village affairs. And of course, this would grow into more of the modern chiefdoms. And again, if you want, for comparison's sake, again, think Native American and was not the United States. But some of these movements would produce kingdoms, such as the village of Congo. The village of Congo will form along the Congo River. These will grow into larger, in fact, kingdoms. And of course, it is the Kingdom of Congo which becomes one of the first contact with the Portuguese in the 1600s. It's one of the first kingdoms to interact with Europeans as the Age of Exploration begins. Now, I say all that to say this. Just because we're talking about the Classical Age empires here does not mean there are not other things going on. And so whether it's the Huns, whether it's the Germanic tribes, whether it's the Bantus in Africa, or whether it's even the Mochi down in Peru, the point is that while these groups may not meet the criteria for a Classical Age empire, they are still vitally important to understand because even though they may not be directly connected to Europe per se, their influence or their future dealings are going to play a really big part. Now, this is the end of this part of this lecture. And we're going to pick up next time with a whole lecture just on the Roman Empire. So until then, take care and bye-bye.